Christmas morning, 1993. I was 9 years old and I'd been begging my parents for a Sega Genesis for months. I wanted Sonic, I wanted Streets of Rage, I wanted to be the cool kid at school who could talk about blast processing. Instead, I woke up to a big, awkwardly wrapped box under the tree with a tag that said to Tommy, "Love Mom and Dad." Inside was something that looked like a Genesis had been left out in the sun too long and then kicked around a flea market. The plastic was cheap gray, already scuffed even though it was brand new. Big yellow and red letters on the front proudly declared, Super Max 16-bit. A faded sticker of a man's face was plastered right on the top of the console. He had a black baseball cap backwards, a thin beard, and this half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked like he was in his early 20s, maybe. I thought it was weird, but kids don't question free stuff. My dad just shrugged and said, it was on sale. Comes with 20 games. The games were tiny. Not normal Genesis cartridges, these were about the size of a matchbox, all the same dull gray with no labels except for a tiny printed face of the same guy on each one. No game titles. Just that same face staring up at me. I plugged it into our old wood panel TV and flipped the power switch. The screen flickered with static, then a cheap chiptune jingle played, the same 4 notes over and over. A title screen appeared in blocky letters. Super Max 16-bit presents, fun time. No menu. No game selection. It just booted straight into the first cartridge I had inserted. The game looked like a bad Sonic knockoff. The little hedgehog character had the same face as the guy on the console. Same cap, same beard, same dead eyes. Every level was the same looping forest background, but the enemies were just distorted versions of that man's face floating around. If you touched one, the screen would flash and a distorted voice, sounding like it was recorded through a broken microphone, would whisper, "He sees you." I thought it was funny at first. I showed my little brother, and we laughed at how creepy and cheap it was. But after an hour, the whispering started happening even when the game was paused. Then it started happening when the console was turned off. That night I woke up to the sound of the TV static. The console wasn't plugged in anymore, Dad had unplugged it before bed. But the screen was on, glowing faint blue, and the man's face from the decal was filling the entire screen, smiling wider than before. I screamed. My parents came running. Dad yanked the power cord out of the wall. The TV went black. The next morning the console was still there on the carpet, face up. The decal on top had changed. The man's eyes were now looking directly at where I was standing. We tried to return it. The store said they'd never carried anything called Super Max 16-bit. My mom threw it in the trash. 2 nights later I woke up to tiny clicking sounds coming from the hallway. When I crept out, I found all 20 of those Matchbox cartridges lined up neatly in front of my bedroom door like little gray soldiers. Each one had the same man's face on it, but now his mouth was open, like he was mid-sentence. I never told my parents about the cartridges. I was too scared they'd think I was lying or sleepwalking. Instead, I hid them in my closet. On New Year's Eve, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard the familiar cheap chiptune coming from inside my closet. I opened the door. All the cartridges were plugged into each other in a daisy chain, connected by some kind of black wires that definitely weren't there before. The top cartridge had its tiny screen glowing. On it, the bearded man was standing in my bedroom, waving slowly. He looked exactly like the decal, but now he was pixelated and moving. He stepped closer to the camera until his face filled the tiny screen, and the same distorted voice came out, clear as day this time. "Tommy, you wanted a Genesis, but you got me instead." The closet door slammed shut by itself. The next morning my parents found me sitting on the floor of my room, staring at the wall. I wouldn't speak for 3 days. When I finally did, I only said one thing. "He's on the console now." He's always been on the console. We moved 6 months later. I made my dad smash the Super Max 16-bit with a hammer before we left. He did it in the driveway while I watched. The plastic cracked easily, but the decal with the man's face stayed perfectly intact, smiling up at us from the broken pieces. Sometimes, even now, 20 years later, I'll be in a thrift store and see an old gray console on a bottom shelf. I don't get close enough to read the name, because I already know what it says. And I know whose face will be looking back at me from the top.